and welcome. I'm Carly Pildes. I am a young leadership board member here at the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington, and thank you for joining tonight. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that tonight's session will be recorded and that closed captioning is available. You can submit your questions throughout the event using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Tonight's program is the third of a three-part series that explores race in the DMV area. For those unable to join the previous sessions, in the first, we heard from Reverend Tim Warner and his children and godchildren about their experiences growing up Black in Montgomery County. In our second panel, we homed in on the experience of Jews of color in our community and brought together a multi-generational panel. And tonight, we want to expand our conversation. We know that anti-Blackness does not exist in a vacuum, and we cannot speak about racism without also speaking about the rise in anti-Asian hate crimes. Daily, we hear about the rise in violence against the Asian American Pacific Islander community, including the murder of 6 women in Atlanta, but also individuals being assaulted and harassed in the street while doing daily activities like grocery shopping. We cannot speak about moving to a place of anti-racism without acknowledging the full threat of violence faced by the marginalized communities in America. Although we do have cause for hope tonight, as the Senate has just passed the Asian American Hate Crimes Response Bill and the Buyer-Hayer No Hate Act. The Federation knows that in order to have a vibrant Jewish community, we must engage, support, and embrace all members of the Jewish community in the DMV and beyond. And we know that creating a community of belonging doesn't happen overnight. It is a process of continuous learning, reflection, and action. And as Rabbi Deborah Waxman has said before, our goal in doing this hard work is not just inclusion. Inclusion is not enough. The goal is transformation. And the work is not something we can put on a list and place a check mark next to it when it is done, which is unfortunate because we are all busy. But it is ongoing, continuous work. And so for tonight, our third session, we will focus on how as individuals and members of the Jewish community and Jewish institutions, we can take action and move towards being actively anti-racist. I am so proud to see the ways in which this work is already taking place in our community, like through the work that the JCRC is doing, and I'm proud to be a board member there as well. We are honored to be joined by a distinguished group of individuals to offer their thoughts and their insights and answer your questions as we continue building our collective understanding of the role of race in our community and move towards a place of growth and a place of equity. Tonight's conversation may bring up a sense of discomfort, whether because you're hearing things about our panelists' experiences that are difficult to hear, or because our own process of reflection is going to be difficult to work through. We ask that you wade through that discomfort with us and sit in that discomfort with us, because discomfort is a critical part of this work. With discomfort comes growth and change. To lead us through this conversation tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Yolanda Savage-Narva. Yolanda recently began her national leadership role with the Union of Reform Judaism as the Director of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Congratulations. Prior to this new exciting role, she advised the Federation in its racial equity work and was Executive Director of a wonderful organization, Operation Understanding DC, a nonprofit whose mission is to create a generation of leaders to promote respect, understanding, and cooperation while fighting to eradicate racism, anti-Semitism, and all forms of discrimination.
Thank you so much, Carly. And it is really an honor and pleasure to be here with you tonight and share this space with you. Thank you for being here for the final program in the Listen, Learn, Create series. Again, I'm Yolanda Savage-Narva. I use she, her pronouns, and I live in Washington, D.C. on Pamunkey, Piscataway, and Anacostan tribal land. So tonight, we will continue to expand our learning with Tema Smith, Yoshi Silverstein, and Rabbi Esther Lederman by exploring how we as individuals and as a collective Jewish community understand and challenge the systems of oppression behind anti-Black and anti-Asian sentiments and be accountable for our actions. Although the George Floyd trial turned out for justice, look at what it took to actually get it there. Overwhelming evidence, a social uprising, when there are countless others going back to 1955 and the murder of Emmett Till, but even further back than that, where justice was never actually served. And then after the George Floyd trial, at least 3 people a day, lives were taken by the hands of police. And so when we think about the things we need to tackle today, there are a couple of things that we must keep in mind. And the first is that we have to look internally, and that's our mirrors work. We have to look at our own biases and our racism, as well as the external piece, and that's our windows work, in order to actually bend the arc of the universe towards justice. And so now it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our amazing panel tonight. And I am going to do very brief introductions because I want to dive in and have a dialogue with these amazing activists and leaders in their communities. And honestly, you can read so much more about them if you Google them. They are amazing and have done amazing work. So I'll start with Tema Smith. Tema is dedicated to building a meaningful and inclusive Jewish community through research, training, writing, and relational engagement. She is currently the Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors and a contributing columnist at The Forward. Rabbi Esther Lederman is the Union for Reform Judaism's Director of Congregational Innovation and sits on the Central Conference of American Rabbis Task Force on the Experience of Women in the Rabbinate. And last but not least, Yoshi Silverstein, who is the founder of the Mitsui Collective. And Yoshi is an educator, a coach, a speaker, a husband, and a father. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. So I'd love to just dive in and pose this question to all 3 of you to think about. Thinking about B'Tselem Elohim, this divine mandate to humanity, what is your why in doing this work? What gets you up every morning? What gets you moving? Why do you do this work? And anyone can unmute and start.
I'll dive in. This is something I think about a lot. For me, it is both personal and political and moral. And it's all 3 of those things. By way of explaining the personal part, because I think it was the personal piece that really got me to do the work. I am the daughter of a Black father and an Ashkenazi Jewish mother. I grew up feeling quite marginalized from Jewish communal life and really wanting it. Our family stuck out like a sore thumb in Jewish space, and really what I was looking for was Jewish connection and meaning. And I found it, fortunately, in my late 20s, and really was driven to sort of say, like, what's going on here? This isn't an isolated experience. First of all, when I did find it, finding other Jews like me took a very long time, and got me really thinking about what does it mean knowing that there are so many other Jews who are racialized, who are from mixed race families, and so on and so forth, who are not connecting to community. But if I wanted to, surely others wanted to as well. And so really that was kind of the impetus that got me into the work in the first place. The political and moral pieces of it are, yes, they're also personal, but B'Tselem Elohim, each and every one of us was created in the image of God. And for me, equity is the least of the things that we should be trying to achieve. Liberation, justice, all of these things are very, I think, important for us to be striving for, not for ourselves, but for every single person who lives among us. And I really think about what does it mean to live in a society like the societies that we live in, when there are people who aren't experiencing the same advantages of that. And to me, that is a moral weight. It is very hard to feel grateful for the security that I have, for all of these things, for loving my work, for all of these wonderful things, when I know that there are still, as Yolanda mentioned, people who get killed in interactions with police who are there to serve and protect, and things like that. And that is just like the bare, like one of the many pieces of this kind of structural racism that pervades North America. So for me, it started personal, and very quickly sort of meshed with my general sort of political and moral beliefs about who we are as a society and what we could be as a society.
Thank you so much, Tema. This idea of moral weight is something that I hope we have some time to come back to toward the end of our time together. So thank you for that.
Can jump in next. Hi, Yolanda. Hi, Esther and Tema. It's great to be here with you. So, when I think about this, I think about there's that idiom that, everything you need to know in life, you can learn in kindergarten. For me, that actually started even earlier in preschool, because I was fortunate enough to go to a Montessori preschool that was housed inside an arboretum. So like recess was just like going and playing in the trees. And for me, it was this experience of just sort of intimate, deep connection with nature, with the, the classroom community and teachers. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, not the most diverse place in the country, but this Montessori preschool was like pretty diverse, all things considered. So there were just all of these pieces that helped me to feel like this is, gave me that foundation of this is what it means to sort of feel connected, to feel whole, to feel like I can really be bringing my full space into a community. In starting to grow up, my family sort of was weaving in and out of Jewish community. So my dad is a European white Ashkenazi Jew. His family comes from Poland, Latvia, Lithuania. My mom is Chinese American. She became a Jew as an adult. Her family comes from Canton province by way of Guyana, amongst other places. And, as I was growing up, we started to get increasingly involved in synagogue life and sort of deeper and deeper into our synagogue community, and actually really became sort of the true sort of second home for me in a way that was really nourishing, and just contributed so much to everything else that I was involved with. In a way that actually I like to say that our community was radically welcoming before it was trendy. I think part of maybe being such a small community, only so many Jews, right? Couldn't really afford to be exclusive. Unfortunately, that feeling started to change as I got more involved and exposed to other things. So going to international conventions, going on a gap year program, just sort of seeing what these conversations were in broader spaces, getting more questions, questioning looks or direct questions, or the questions of like, where are you from, right? Where it was clear that I wasn't quite fitting in the way that I sort of didn't realize I wouldn't be when I was younger. Also the question of intermarriage, I sort of, as I was coming of age, so to speak, high school, early college, that was sort of right at the peak of what thankfully is now a changed conversation, but the conversation that was basically an unchallenged assertion that intermarriage was going to be the death of the Jewish people, right? And that was just, it was like an unchallenged assumption that would just be put into these spaces that I was in, right? And not as a question, as a statement, right? Just like an assumption that everyone must believe. And I'd just be sitting there like, hi, like, that's me, that's my parents, right? My mom, did become Jewish as an adult, but like they were an intermarried family. So I just started to see the ways that amongst other things, because of my racial identity and other things, I was just sort of encountering aspects of a system that wasn't really of a system and a culture that hadn't evolved with people like me in mind, right? Where someone with my background, et cetera, was just like on very few people's radars or assumption around what was normative. And I just started to encounter more and more of that disconnect. So, for me, what really brings me into this is thinking about what are all the ways that we can bring ourselves as individuals and our communities together through sort of reconnection, through thinking about how we bring greater wholeness and healing into the world. My particular work is most centered in embodied Jewish practice, both in the racial equity lens and also through other aspects of ritual and prayer and music and movement. So a lot of different ways that really think about how do we experience Jewish life and learning through our bodies. And also this question of how is our experience of Jewish community and of Jewish life and learning impacted because of the bodies that we're in, right? Because of the racial identities amongst other historically marginalized identities that can really impact how we both mentally and emotionally and physically have this experience of being in spaces that can be really, really different from folks whose identities haven't historically been marginalized or excluded in the same ways.
Thank you so much, Yoshi. I think it's so beautifully articulated about how you made this connection when you were young to your whole self, to nature, and then how that embodies the way you see your Judaism and the need for us to reconnect in a very different way. I think that's beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. Rabbi Lederman.
Hi, it's so great to be with all of you on this call today and to listen to your stories and experiences. So my why comes sort of, I'm going to weave three parts of what it means to be a member of my family, of what it means to be a Jew, and what does it mean to be an American. So I'm a rabbi. When I told my parents that I was choosing to become a rabbi, let's just say they were a little surprised by this choice. It wasn't that they were against it. They were, wow, okay, that's not the direction we expected you to go. And we sort of thought you'd follow us in our footsteps to be working for the government or working in the psychological field. And my father pulled me aside because he said, I want to support you, but I want to tell you a story. And he told me a story, a horrifying story of racism in the Jewish community. So my father had worked in Lesotho in Nigeria in the 50s and 60s. It's a whole other part of my past, but and he'd been doing all this with the United Nations, doing all this development work. And he came home on a home visit to visit his family in Montreal, Canada. And his brother invited the Jewish community over for lunch, including the local rabbi. And the local rabbi pulled him aside and said, Rabbi, why are you not in Israel working with, the Jews? You should be helping the Jews instead of working with those. And then he used a Yiddish term, a very derogatory term that basically is the equivalent of the N-word. And this is the story my father decides to tell me as I just told him I want to be a rabbi. And he tells me he's had plenty, I think, of more or less better experiences with rabbis after that point. But he was so worried. Like this man basically turned him off Judaism for about 20 years. It was my mother who brought him back because she converted. So one, I looked at my dad and I said, that's not who you raised me to be. So even though I'm going to be a rabbi, I'm going to be a different kind of rabbi. I'm going to be a rabbi that is the rabbi who supports B'Tselem Elohim. Even though I knew, I probably didn't know, but I know now that I had so much to learn about racism. So that's a little bit of the family and the Jew part, that this is what when I think of the moral weight Tema spoke about, this is what it means. This is what it means to have that fight. The second story, the last bit I'll say as an American. Tomorrow, I take my oath of citizenship. This is like a really big deal. The questions you have to answer for a naturalized citizen versus someone who's born here are questions you don't have to answer. Like, will I take up arms to support the United States government? As I sat there, as they gave me the test this week, and I had to study the Constitution, I had to study a whole civics part. You know, what does it mean to be an American? And my husband was preparing me. He happens to be a constitutional lawyer. And we were having a huge debate about the Constitution and its racist history. And he looked at me and he's like, are you going to go into that interview and talk about the racist Constitution before you take your test? And I said, no, I can play the part there. But if I'm going to take on and take that oath and get that certificate and then go register to vote and then go get my passport, I better be prepared to take on what I would describe as the moral sins that this country was founded on, which is slavery, and the legacy that slavery continues to play out in our world today. So otherwise, then I don't deserve to have the passport. Like, if I'm not going to take on the responsibilities of that kind of the American that I want to be, then I don't want to take it on. So for me, it's a lot about, for me now, I say this in front of my Canadian friend, Tema, you know, what does it mean to be an American Jew? Now that I can really claim the term American Jew. And to me, that's being an anti-racist, and that's grappling with the imperfect and many of the imperfections that have been built into the body politic of the United States.
Well, just very briefly, I am a dual citizen also, so welcome to the club.
I have a lot of friends who are Canadian.
This is, of all of the panels I've been on, probably the most Canadian that any of my recent panels have been, and I kind of love it.
It's cool, isn't it? You know, Rabbi Lederman, I think what you described is really key to this work, you know, is, you know, kind of individually, you know, as an individual, taking responsibility for kind of something that has been inherited. You're becoming, you know, a citizen of the United States. And, you know, in essence, that means taking on the responsibilities of the way this country has kind of created this system of the way we all function. And there's really no separating and getting away from that. So, wow, that's powerful. That's very powerful. So thank you all for sharing your why. I am actually going to focus on Yoshi for a moment. And so Yoshi, you know, interestingly enough, you and I saw each other earlier. And as always, you have something, you know, profound and very thought-provoking to say. And it played over and over in my mind, actually, and I wanted to ask you about it here. And that was this idea of the work that we're doing around trying to become anti-racist as transactional and transformational. And when do we play those roles? Is there one that is more important than the other? And do each of those roles, the transactional piece and the transformational piece, play a role in trying to move the needle on becoming an anti-racist community?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think, first of all, is that they're both important. They both play necessary roles. The you know, and these won't be textbook definitions, but as I think about what those two sort of terms mean, and the sort of transactional is built on top of the transformational, so we can sort of picture that structure. I think for a lot of people, especially folks who are working in Jewish communal organizations, institutions, places that have just some sort of like institutional framework, and folks that are trying to figure out like, okay, we see that there are these issues of racial equity. We know that we're trying to, like, we need to improve in our like diversity, equity, inclusion, et cetera. And I think like, okay, so what do we do? What are the steps that we take? And so I think a lot of those initial things that people think about are the transactional, and they're important, right? But some of these things are like, okay, we need to hire more people of color, Jews of color and non-Jewish, et cetera, right? We need to hire more Jews of color. Let's just keep it in the Jewish context, because that's what I know best. We need to hire more Jews of color. We need to like get some Jews of color on our board. Maybe we're, thinking about, participants, right? Any institution that has participants of any sort, I think, are thinking about like, and especially for folks who have been paying attention, or been exposed to the research work coming from the Jews of Color Initiative that showed that around 12 to 15% of the US Jewish population, 12 to 15% are Jews of color, right? So that's 1 out of every 7. That's like, even for those of us who've been in this work for a while, it's just like kind of mind blowing. It means if there's like 7 million Jews in the United States, 1 million of us are people of color, like, right? So those are like genuinely really remarkable numbers. And for the most part, we look around our communities and we don't see that represented, right? Like if you have a minyan, often it's like, you're lucky if you have even 1 Jew of color in the minyan, let alone 2 or 3, right? So those are all some sort of like transactional things of like, literally the transaction, we've got X number, and we need to change some of those numbers, right? And like, and again, those can be helpful steps towards especially getting the right voices around the table, especially when you're talking about where decisions are made, whether that be institutional decisions, federation, sort of community-wide decisions in a school around curriculum. So these things are all important, and they're transactional. They sort of sit on that top level, and they tend not to address the underlying roots that have created and led to the issues, and will continue to perpetuate them if they're not addressed. And so that's where the transformational comes in. And that's where we need to then look at what are the underlying sort of cultural and systemic issues that are at play, and how do we really tackle those things. That work is in a lot of ways harder. It almost always takes more time, and it's really critical. Because if we only stay at transactional, we're just going to kind of keep doing this, or the kind of thing where you hire that Jew of color in an entirely white, institution, and they burn out really quickly because guess what? You didn't do the ecosystem work of addressing the entire culture of organization to become more anti-racist. And I know we haven't talked, I think we're going to talk about what does anti-racist mean? So acknowledging for folks who are kind of unsure about that, but ecosystem analysis is part of transformational work. It's saying, what is this entire space? What are the relationships that exist here? What are the, the inputs, the outputs, like all of those things that we might think of from an ecological sense, we can think of in a community or an organizational sense. And we need to be doing both at once, right? So that we're not tokenizing, bringing in that single or even a handful of folks who are just then working uphill against a system that is not being sort of deconstructed and reconstructed in a way that will sort of make the entire thing, more equitable and work better and sort of more transformational.
I was, vigorously taking notes too. I mean, I think that that's such a beautiful articulation of the importance of transactional and transformational change and how both of them are a part of it. It makes me actually think about one of my colleagues, and I think Rabbi Lederman, you've seen this slide where there's this picture, it talks about the ecosystem, and there's a tree, big, beautiful, like oak tree or something along those lines, and then there's cactus in the desert. And it talks, and so it talks about how people have not created the ecosystem to bring that oak tree in to the desert. And so if you think about that, that's that transformational piece that has to happen while the transactional part's happening at the same time. Rabbi Lederman or Tema, any thoughts around that piece?
No, I think Yoshi really articulated it really, really well. I just want to sort of dwell one more time on that, on what Yoshi said right at the end, and that tree analogy is the burnout piece is very real, and very often as well, what ends up happening, and I see this both in my own personal experiences, but also with organizations that I've worked with, is you see people come into, whether it's as staff or participants who are people of color, and that's something that you've decided that you want to prioritize. But with those people stop coming for whatever reason. Let's say they move away or they get a different job or whatever it might be, and they're not automatically replenished, right? And so sometimes people step in for any number of reasons, and feel comfortable there or don't feel comfortable there and move on. And if that sort of groundwork isn't done, there's really no guarantee that you've actually checked that checkbox. And I think that's something that we often forget, is just because one person shows up doesn't mean that we've actually moved the ground to where we think we have.
I'll just add briefly, I love that. First of all, I love the image. I'm a visual person, Yoshi. So the idea when you said put it on top, I actually drew a little diagram of it sitting on top. The other piece I will say, as a white person in this space, what I loved also about this transactional versus transformational, right, is those transactional steps. I appreciated the definition, because I was like, oh, what are you claiming are transactional steps? And it made a lot of sense. Is very we need to get you in here. We need to get you hired. We need to get you on a board. We need to get you as participants. But the transformational piece is actually what do I need to change as the white person? What does the white dominant culture piece need to change? So I also appreciated that dichotomy, because I will admit that when I started doing this work, and starting to realize this is important, and this is actually this is lifelong work, that actually I got to start with it's not about how many people of color I interact with, or I got to start with my own internal biases. I got to start with the fact that I'm a white person and I've never been able to say that before, all of those pieces that needed to change. So I also like the mix of those two pieces as well, in your theory, and it makes a lot of sense.
Just something really quickly. I just wanted to say that to sort of give credit to the teachers, that I am fortunate to learn with. So I've been learning about that whole framework, transactional and transformational, through work I've been doing with Imani Romney Rosa Chapman, who's a Black and Latinx Jew, amazing educator, and Franny Silverman, who's a white Jew, and they do frequent work together, and I've been plugging in with some things with them together. So I want to just give them credit for being a source of wisdom. And then the other, I was just thinking, Rabbi Deborah Waxman was mentioned earlier. She had a really, really great article recently in E-Jewish Philanthropy. And it was about the racial equity work that the Reconstructionist movement is doing. And Rabbi Sandra Lawson has been hired to really run that up, and a really beautiful parallel role, I think, to yours, Yolanda, which is just those, either one of you by yourself is kind of on the fence. Is that transactional or transformational, in a sense, although you two are amazing humans, but the fact that both of those are happening at once, that is now we're getting transformational. So that's one thing. And then specifically in that piece that Rabbi Deborah wrote, she just had this really great line that was basically to the extent of we need to expect transformation. If we're not expecting transformation through the racial equity work, then we're either not serious about it, or we are not really understanding what the work is about. And she was and I'm here for it. I am excited for the transformation to happen, because I'm excited about what it's going to look like on the other end, right? So just in this lens of transformation, and I think what a beautiful, just thinking about the beauty of the other side, and just the openness and expansive nature of thinking about and not in a sense that I mean, I'm going off on a slight tangent, but I think, I think there's a thing where people do get concerned that about loss, right? We grew up with something, with our experience of Judaism, of our Jewish community, of what Jewish learning, Jewish practice looks like to us. And as with any periods of change, I think there's a very normal, natural, anxiety about what is going to be lost when things change. And I want to just want to like recognize that is real and important for folks. And I think at the same time, in parallel, like change is happening. Like literally the Jewish community is changing. Again, going back to some of the data, we're already at 12 to 15%. That number is going to keep on going higher. And just as it is in the United States in general, right, the proportion of Black and brown folks is increasing. And so that means the Jewish community is also going to continue to get Blacker and browner. And if we want a Jewish community that really represents, or if we want our institutions and our sort of, the organizations that represent and create containers for community, if we want those to represent the actuality of who the Jewish people are, we need to be open to the change. We need to be open to that transformation and ready to, I think, receive and I think for me, seeing how much amazing, creative, generative, nourishing work comes when you open up to all these different streams of what people are bringing, the Torah that people bring into the community. There's a really amazing, beautiful stuff that can happen. So I think, yeah, going back to it, like I'm ready for the transformation, and I hope others are too.
Yeah, I am too. And knowing that I have partners like you on this call who are ready for it and already involved in, some of the transactional pieces, but a lot of the transformation is very inspiring. Tema, can I ask you a specific question? We talked about change happening, transactional, transformative change. What is the external piece of that? If you think about it and you had to point folks in a specific direction about how they can do their windows work, what are the things that they need to make sure they have in place in order to make sure that external, piece of the work is still happening? What would you suggest?
Right. So I think one of the things that I always struggle with a lot in conversations I have in Jewish communal spaces about race is that the Jewish community, the parts of the Jewish community that care deeply about racial justice do a pretty good job at showing up. And when I say that, I mean showing up, whether it's through advocacy, I hear a lot of the time dialogue with like local Black communal organizations, especially Black churches, and really showing up to sort of do that transformative work on a national scale. And, whether it's, like I said, lobbying, advocacy, voting in certain ways, all of those sorts of pieces. But the piece that has been very hard, I think, for the Jewish community to do is look inwards. And I think that as long as we aren't looking inwards, we're missing a crucial part. It's a lot easier to sort of say, well, the society I live in is this way and I am not, and sort of push for change on that level. And at the same time, the Black Jew who showed up to Shabbat at your synagogue was questioned for 10 minutes at the door about what they're doing there by somebody who was on the Racial Justice Committee with you. That's something I've heard, by the way. That's a real story. And so this is some of the pieces that are really tricky. There's a lot of conversation that I see cropping up again and again and again, Jewish social media, Jewish press, about how talking about race is divisive. in Jewish spaces. It comes up again and again. Conversations about how critical race theory is inherently anti-Semitic, which it is not at all. And I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on that, but if you're interested in understanding more about that, my friend Mia Brett wrote a great piece in the foreword specifically on that. So she has a PhD who is an expert and is an expert in this. And she wrote a piece on that. And it's very painful, what I will say, personally, to hear that my experiences of racism inside Jewish spaces either are dismissed as like, well, that was an outlier. It was not. Or okay, yeah, we'll get to it after we fight for this other racial justice thing somewhere else. And I often say that until we have our own house in order, we're not actually showing up for other people. We're actually doing a pretty bad job at racial justice work because we're blaming other people for the problems. And you hear that a lot in Jewish spaces, like, well, we all came as immigrants and inherited these problems. And I'm like, yes, and we internalized them. Alana Kaufman, my friend and colleague who runs the Jews of Color Initiative, put it really brilliantly one time. Like, it's not like we live in some hermetically sealed Ziploc bag. We don't. We live we live in America, and I'm just across the border in Canada, and those are racist societies, and we have inherited those legacies of racism and internalized them. I hear stories all the time. I have my own personal stories, many personal stories over the years. And some of, I think, the things that are considered, that people consider well-intentioned, but are just sort of not understanding sort of the impact. I can give a personal example of having wanted to participate in something with other Jews of color. Until recently, I was always the only Jew of color on the staff of whatever organization I worked for. When another Jew of color got hired where I work now, I was like, whoa, this is wild. But I was always the only one and was looking for community, and especially didn't know very many here. And this is before sort of I had a large internet community of Jews of color. And I sort of expressed a desire to go to it. And I was met with sort of like, okay, but like, you might want to do that, but is that really an organizational priority for us? And it was that question in that moment of like, at first I was like, okay, fine, I get it. But at the same time, it was that lack. Later on, I sort of look back on it, I was like, no, like I was asking for something to connect me to community so that I can continue to support this community. and I needed that. That was the nourishment that I needed, because I was showing up every day to a community that didn't fully understand me. And so this is like what's at stake, really, is that there are so many of us who are here, who are doing the work, who are building. And like, I'm building so that Jews who are like me can have Jewish community, but I'm building Jewish community. I'm not building mixed race Jewish community. I'm not building Black Jewish community. I do this work every day because Judaism and a vibrant, vital Jewish community is something that I value very deeply and want more people to have access to. I don't want to cheapen what it is. I don't want to water it down. I came to it through Jewish studies academia, to finding a Jewish community in this way. I have a very deep commitment to that. And I think there's this lack of understanding, though, that I still show up as a mixed race person who's experienced racism, who still has a father who is not Jewish, who is Black, who grew up on Staten Island experiencing American racism and, brought that into our home. And so understanding that that is my experience as a Jew, not as somebody who like leaves half of an identity at the door when I step into Jewish space. And so the work that we have to do, just to be very sort of tactical, tangible about it, is that we have to stop assuming that you're Jewish in the Jewish space and the rest of you is not in that space. We have to stop assuming that people who don't look, I mean, I don't experience this because you see me, I walk into a space, white skin, curly brown hair, glasses, people jump to conclusions very quickly about me and are usually surprised when they find out I'm mixed, which is a whole other experience and set of microaggressions that I experience very regularly. But that people who don't look like me stepping into spaces belong there and don't deserve to be questioned and grilled, don't have to give you their resume. I hear it described as a spiritual resume really often, of having to sort of list how they came to be in your synagogue on that day. And we need to do the transactional sort of DEI work, diversity, equity, inclusion work, which is saying like, hey, actually, we do happen to know somebody really talented and amazing who would be a great person on this board. And do that at the same time that you're doing the transformational work so that they stay on your board. And I think that's really, there's no checkbox. This is hard. Every time I do a training, I say, this isn't a 2-year process. This isn't a 5-year process. This is a 10-year process. And that's really hard for people to hear because we care deeply about doing the work, generally speaking, and want it to be done, but it's slow. It's slow and steady. And there's a lot of trust to be won back as well from people who've been hurt.
Can I jump in? I think, yeah, I'm just thinking about this, the relationship of this, like the externally facing and the internally facing. And I think, I mean, absolutely agree with everything that Tema said. And so building off of that, I think there's a way in which the internal is the external and the external is the internal. So let me explain what I mean. I think that there's there's assumptions around, I mean, so just thinking about like, yeah, what happens to a Jew of color when they are in a Jewish space, or in some cases trying to get into a Jewish space and they're met with resistance, right? So like, that's an important piece of it. And I think, you know, and I think that like earlier on in this sort of like work of building awareness around Jews of color, et cetera, like that was the sort of step where it was like just the awareness that Jews of color exist, that we're not like one-off unicorns, like so rare that, you know what I mean? Like there's actually like a lot of us and that we exist, right? So like just that has been, for a lot of folks, like a pretty significant step up in just their understanding and awareness. Then there's next levels off of that. And that's where I think, I mean, in some ways I'm glad to see the conversation is going, but like, it's like, we can't just stop at that awareness, right? And so I think there's some assumptions that like, okay, Jews of color exist, we get that theoretically, and maybe we see a few in our communities and institutions, but we're saying like, okay, we're not seeing the numbers that match up with, like in our communities, that match up with what the sort of statistical estimates are. So where are the Jews of color, right? It's a good question, right? I feel like there are some assumptions that, okay, all the Jews of color are basically living in all the same places and doing mostly all the same things that the white Jews are doing, right? Like they live in the same cities and the same neighborhoods and have similar blah, 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 right? They're just not coming to shul, right? And like, so they're already here, we just got to get them in shul, you know, and that's true for some, definitely. But what I think we don't always think about is like, well, guess what? If you're a person of color who's also Jewish, and maybe you either at some point in your life or, you know, your parents like tried to get involved and were rebuffed, right? Enough times that like, you're like, okay, and you stopped coming. Or maybe you just grew up with like very little or like no Jewish identity because for whatever reason. Guess what? That's probably not your primary identity, and that's like driving the, like what you do in life, in your motivations and the communities that you seek out. So if you're a person of color and you happen to also be Jewish, and being Jewish is not a primary identity in your life, guess what? You're probably gonna do things that are like things that people of color tend to do, right? So like you're probably living in predominantly POC communities, for example. And so what happens is like when we apply some of these lenses, and one, just take a quick step back, like there are plenty of reasons for Jews of any racial identity to work with predominantly Black and brown communities who are not Jewish, to be working in solidarity for mutual liberation. So I don't want any doubt, like in terms of what I'm about to say, like that's important by itself, Dayenu. And there's this way in which when we think about that lens of, we know that Jews of color are out there, right? Not only how does it change how we look at our, you know, mainstream Jewish communities and who is and isn't there, it changes how we look at like the other. And if we're in, like, let's say, whatever, we're like at an anti-racism, like racial solidarity march, whatever, there's like a bunch of like Black and brown people there. Do you have that lens of like, oh, a bunch of those people might be Jewish? So it actually changes how we are looking at who we consider to be other. And like, that's the transformation, is it needs to change our like implicit subconscious assumptions around who is Jewish and who's not Jewish, and like where the Jews are, right? Who may not being served by our communities or by the institutions or by like the ways in which we have built things, again, without certain people in mind, right? It's like we built a table. It's like we built a table like someone, like a family of all really tall people, custom built their house, and all of the like counters and the doorknobs and like the chairs, they're all like abnormally high because that's really comfortable for that family. And then someone like me who's short comes in, it's like I'm like trying to chop the vegetables up here. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just like something's off. And then the tall family might have no idea. They're like, yeah, all this works perfectly for us. It's great. And they're like, well, not working so great for me.
Wow, very, very powerful. I do want to add that we are taking questions. So if you have any questions, please send them to where they need to go so I can get them. I'm not quite sure what the mechanism is, but I will eventually get them. So thanks for your questions in advance. And I want to switch gears and ask Rabbi Lederman about the kind of internal mirrors work, because and really your perspective. I'm going to use some terms here because I don't know exactly which ones you use, and there are lots of them out there that are used, I think, to describe white friends who are in this movement and work with us. Ally is one word that's been used for a long time. Co-conspirator is a newish word, co-conspirator. And then there's abolition, an abolitionist in, you know, this movement. So thinking about those three, thinking, you know, I don't know which one you use, but I'm just curious to know from your lens, you know, what is your role around kind of the internal piece, or getting people to recognize what that looks like from your vantage point?
So appreciate the question. I mostly call myself an ally, but I want to take co-conspirator. Maybe it's because I'm very moved by John Lewis's Good Trouble. I want to get in some good trouble with people who are okay getting in good trouble. I'm so glad you asked about the internal piece. It's something that's really, as we talk about the internal piece, I do a lot of the internal piece. I mean, I care about the external piece, but I feel like this is in some ways, as a white ally in this work, this is where some of my Torah, I'm meant to be. And I love the language, Yolanda, about mirror, because I think this is really about looking at and not at the mirrors that make you look prettier, but the mirrors that actually really help you look deeply at what's there and what's underneath it all. So for me, a lot of that has started just in my own work and my own experiences. A lot of that has been about recognizing my whiteness, right? Like I grew up in a world where color blindness was like, right? You don't mention race, you don't talk about race. And one, realizing actually that's actually really unhelpful, right, to moving forward, because actually color does mean, in this country, color means so much. And we've assigned it. I mean, Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, I mean, if you have not read that book or listened to it or borrowed it from the library, go out and read it. And it's more than just about reading. But one, recognizing that I'm a white person, and getting more and more comfortable with naming that. So a lot of that, I mean, I'll just say that a lot of my work when I'm calling people in, which is I'm trying to think about the best way to describe calling in. It's like, I was on a call recently, actually, and I saw somebody do it very publicly and beautiful. Someone made it was like a worship service, and it was like the board was talking, and somebody made a very awful stereotype about drivers of a certain ethnic origin. And the rabbi just looked at him and said, I'll just use a general name, Jim, you don't really mean that, do you? and he just was like, anyway, I use that as an example of because I feel like a lot of what I do right now is calling people I'm in relationship with, and sometimes people I'm not even in close relationship with. So people I have a transformational covenantal relationship with, and people I have a transactional relationship with, just to use those language, to sort of say, no, but you are white. Like I've had this conversation a lot. I particularly have had it with mostly white Ashkenazi Jewish men who don't feel like they are, or they've had experiences of anti-Semitism. And I'll say, I'm not trying to take away the anti-Semitic experience from you. What I am trying to say is that you walk into a space and you are seen in a different way. And most of you are not walking in with, tzitzit, your fringes hanging out, and a kippah on your head, and a big Magen David, a big Star of David on your shirt. So you're just walking in and you look like your average white guy. And that means you have white privilege, which basically just means that you have certain rights and privileges, and also some immunity from being burdened by things that people of color are burdened with in this country. So a lot of it has been recognizing that we as Jews, many of us, not the percentage Yoshi was talking about, but there are a lot of white Jews out there. And unless we're willing to grapple with our whiteness and what that has meant, is really important. The other touchstone for me has been Abraham Joshua Heschel's line about some are guilty, all are responsible. Because a lot of times I hear, well, my people, we came over in 1880, we had nothing to do with slaves, or you're right, and I'm Canadian. Nothing to do, I'm sure my country did other terrible things to its indigenous population. But that's what it means to be responsible, right? Like, yes, I'm not going to go to jail for something, but I have, going back to Tema's line about moral weight, like, I will say this, like, I'm not guilty for slavery, but a lot of us are living off the accumulated wealth that, we've been able to accumulate because of, basically like free labor that built this country. So, I mean, I feel you can cut me off, Yolanda, at any time, by the way, if you want to interrupt me. But I think about what for me is a big part of this, of doing the internal work. It's the whiteness, it's the white privilege, it's listening to people of color in a way that, like, some white people are uncomfortable with the term reparations. Like I heard a debate recently about not whether we should support it, but just the term, and maybe we should call it restorative justice. And I kept thinking, this is what people of color are calling it. Let's just call it reparations. And by the way, Jewish folks, we've had reparations for the Jews. We seem to be fine when it was called reparations, when it was for, Holocaust slaughter. Why is it not okay for African Americans in this country? So and being okay a little bit in, I use humor sometimes to call people in, but also to I'm sometimes the mirror now for people. And I'll end with this. And sometimes I'm that person. You know what I mean, maybe by that, maybe I need to be more clear. Like, I sometimes feel like I'm going to walk into a space and I'm going to be, oh, Esther Lederman, there she is. She's going to be that person who says something. Because that's what it means to be an ally. like if I'm in a space with Yolanda, because we work together, like it's not on Yolanda to call it out. Right? Like, and I've done that a number of times for our institution in places where it's like, there's already enough burden to be like when a person of color wakes up in this country to put on clothes and walk out, you're carrying a burden I don't carry. I need to do my part. I can't do it all. And I don't want to usurp power away. Like, I think I'm also aware of the concept of like, what does it mean for me to make space? Like to pull back and say, this is a space for people of color to lead. And also the calling out or the calling in, because I can say things. I can use my privilege to say things to other white people. Let me just be clear on who I'm saying it to. I'll stop.
No, I mean, first off, thank you. I appreciate, having you as an ally in this work that we're all trying to do, because I think it was actually Ta-Nehisi Coates who said it. I was looking for his book, but I don't see it around to actually read the quote, but I'm paraphrasing that it can't just be the Black and brown folks fighting for racial justice and equity. It's just at a point where there has to be allies and co-conspirators in this fight with us, because it actually impacts every single one of us in some way. And so I think that's really important. Esther.
Well, I just add, like, we have a colleague, Rachel Hall, beloved teacher, a white woman on our staff who has been a real teacher of mine at the URJ, who in a conversation, and I just, it still stays with me so resonant. She's like, I think the quote was about Black women or maybe Black trans women, but it was like, if we take care of Black women in this country, guess what everybody else is taken care of, right? And just that belief that that I don't want to live in a world in which I'm only looking at it for my own, but I just firmly believe that, like, if we take care of the least among us, which in my opinion, women of color in this country, pay wage, just like the statistics on so many things, like, we'll just be a better country. We'll all be better. White men will be better. White women will be better. Our children will be better. And so why wouldn't we sort of think about that? So yes, that piece about, like, we will be a whole and transformed community if we can if we can also just like let go a little bit of like that lost piece. Yoshi really resonated. Like, what are we so afraid of losing? And maybe there is real loss, and we need to acknowledge that in like white affinity spaces where like you can name it. Also, because it shouldn't be burdened, like, because people of color don't need to hear the burdens of white people. But also, like, it's also that mindset of abundance. What can you gain? What could you gain also?
Excellent point.
Can I build off that?
Yes.
So that's perfect. That's exactly where I was going to go, Esther, is like, what do white folks have to gain in this work? And the answer is, spoiler alert, the answer is a lot. And I think there's a few things that I've been thinking about as you've been speaking, and which is one, like, yes, like for folks who are white, and I'm like half brown and I'm half white, to which, doesn't actually make any sense, but like, you know what I mean? But to like acknowledge whiteness, and I fully understand like the relationship of Jews to white supremacy as a whole, and of like white Jews / Jews of European descent, right? I mean, it's funny, all of the different like ways in which we try to like ever more complicate it. It is complicated, it's complex, right? So that is something I want to absolutely acknowledge. And just because it's complicated doesn't mean it's not true. And so I think we tend to think of racialized identities as only applying to Black and brown folks, but actually, if you are white, you also have a racialized identity, because not just in the US, our entire world is built, at this point, is built on racism. right? So, and racism, I want to say like hatred, bias, prejudice, those are things that go back probably to the all of human history, right? Or at least back to like Cain and Abel. Racism does not. Racism is only 500 or 600 years old because racism is actually a belief system based on the creation of racial categories that have nothing to do inherently with anything based in any sort of objective truth about biology or even ecology or like any of that. It's constructs of racial identity and a belief system that was built to prop up European colonization and to basically create the backing, the belief system for the subjugation of Black and brown folks to create more power for European colonialism, right? And so that goes back 500, 600, and it has since shaped everything that happens. But what that means is that, yes, that's when we started to see like these racial categories, but also including like white as a racial category. And so that's one. Number two is that these things are fluid. They're not fixed. Like things change over time. And so it's absolutely true that like, I mean, just gonna say like Nazi Germany did not consider any Jews white. That is true, right? And the realities of 2021, thank God, are different than Nazi Germany, mostly, right? But like things have changed. So I think one, again, acknowledging like a white identity, but it also, so I think it's important to acknowledge that, but also there's a difference between acknowledging and like accepting that that is like a fixed forever truth. And so I think that's where, again, it sort of gets into more of the nuance and subtlety. But just as like, I mean, the specifics of my identity, I mean, I've been racialized as, you know, like an Asian person, as mixed race, etc. But like, what does that actually say about me, Yoshi, as a human? Not very much. The pieces of my identity that actually have an impact are the specifics of here's where in China my family comes from. And oh, my grandma grew up in Guyana when it was under British colonial rule. So she spoke with like a British West Indian accent, right? And like, here's the foods my grandpa brought. And like, right, it's the specifics, like those are the things that have really shaped my identity in real ways. And in the same thing where it's like, you know, so the loss that's happened is that someone who is maybe Irish and there's real meaning in that lineage, right? They also lose something because of the way that whiteness homogenizes and flattens identity in service of like whiteness and power, in service of white supremacy, right? And there's a real loss there, right? And so I think that that's part of what we have to gain. I think of it as like, we need to acknowledge whiteness and also think about what does that mean, like decentering whiteness. But at the same time, I think part of the countering that folks, all of us of any racial identity need to do is then also really figure out how we are rooting ourselves in our own identity, right? Because, and so if you are a white, you know, Jew whose family is from Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, like my dad's side of the family, right? To really think specifically what that means, which is great because it means like if your family spoke Yiddish and you speak Yiddish or you want to learn more about Yiddish, amazing, go learn Yiddish. Like, and you're actually fighting white supremacy by learning Yiddish, right? Or like, think about like the gefilte Ria, like really thinking like really just like elevating, you know, Eastern European, like, you know, shtetl food, like, you know, like bringing that back and reconnecting to those roots, etc. So all of that work is really critical because it like brings the roots, it brings the specificity. And the last thing I'll say is like, that's important because if we don't do that, right, and especially for those folks who are white, right, it allows you to try to think that you can approach it from this like intellectual, theoretical, untethered place, which allows you to keep a distance from it. And if we're approaching this work from a distance, we're never going to make the transformational change that we need to. We need to understand what's my place, what's my role in this whole narrative, right? And what's my role in fixing it.
Well said, Yoshi. So we have a couple of questions that have come through that I want to pull up, and I will start with this one, and maybe if we can just, you know, kind of, let's see, I just want to make sure we can get to all of them. Maybe keep our answers a little bit shorter this time, and then we can maybe get to some of the questions that have come through. So this one is talking about pre-pandemic and security. And basically the question is, some congregations made tough decisions to have security officers in plain clothes on site for events and services. And some Jews of color expressed their angst or wouldn't even attend when seeing on-duty security. And what's the wisdom for transformation around that when we get back into the building? And the security question.
So this is a question, I'm just gonna say it plainly, that's gonna plague us for a while. Like, this question isn't going away. And the hard part is that the reality is Jewish institutions need security. We are under threat. I say this, I've worked in 2 synagogues and a Jewish organization. And I jokingly say, you know, it's not sort of a normal experience to walk into a fortified building when you work in a religious community like that. And that's the experience of working in Jewish space. And I feel it very acutely, having, you know, been the person to have to lock up the synagogue building at night when I worked in a smaller congregation, and the feeling of like looking around to see who was outside. So I don't want to like at all downplay that security risk. And that was, you know, already 6 years ago, and things are only getting worse. And I think that this is a conversation that comes up very frequently when I do trainings in Jewish communal space, because there isn't an easy answer. And I think that the reality is that we need to make sure that we're involving Jews of color, and particularly Black Jews, particularly Black male Jews, in the conversations around security. And we need to be sure that we are making sure that the security who is there are aware of the existence of Black Jews. I think it's really done through relationship, through training, intensive training, and you know, I hear things like, well, make sure that the security guards are also people of color. That doesn't actually help anything much. It doesn't change anything much. Black police also profile Black people. Like, that's real. That's statistically, like, we see the statistics of it. Just changing the race of your security guards does not do a whole lot to address the issue. I really think that this is just something that we need to keep chipping away at as a community. And, you know, and this is sort of, I don't mean this to sound flippant, but also when we actually work to address the structural issues that are leading to the kinds of anti-Semitism that we see, which, by the way, are the same things leading to the kinds of racism where Black people get killed by police, when we actually are working to dismantle those, eventually, actually, this isn't a question anymore. We're in that might be a little utopian. I'm like, you know, maybe a little bit too like, Moshiach will come one day. But the reality is, I think that this is what we're all trying to work towards. And in the meantime, it's just making sure that the right people are at the table having the conversation, to make sure that when security is needed, security is done in as good a way as possible. And the sad reality is that that still will not feel safe to some people in our community because of the experiences that they have had and because of what they have seen happen. And that is a sad reality that breaks my heart every single day. And I don't have an answer beyond that, because what we're ultimately trying to do is balance the security of our community against the fears that somebody else's security might be at stake. And one is like a very sort of tangible thing, and one is a hypothetical theoretically, although also a very tangible thing when that's your experience. And I think, you know, just making sure I wish I had, like I said, I wish I had a better answer. And I think about this so much, but it is about who's at that table having that conversation. Because at the end of the day, a all-white House committee making security decisions, not often isn't actually considering the very real feelings of Jews of color within the community. It's still abstract and theoretical. Those people need to be at that table.
Bottom line, and that's where that transformation starts to happen too. When you're really bringing the voices in of everyone in your community. Thank you, Tema. We have another question we want to try to get to, and it is asking, where do we see the Orthodox Jewish community in this conversation? It sounds like there's a lot of work happening in the reform movement. Is there anything that you can share more about how we bring this work across the Jewish community?
I think what I'll say here is just like, I know that there are a number of leaders in the Orthodox community, both Jews of color and white Jews, who are leading in this work. I continue to like learn from those folks, and folks are out there, they're doing really good work. Yeah, you know, I mean, sure, there may be cases that as with in other areas, like some of the framing or the, you know, some of the sort of core understandings of Orthodox Judaism versus reform or conservative, like, right, they're like different language, different frameworks, different sort of like vocabularies. And I think, yeah, I think we shouldn't assume that there's not a critical mass of folks in the Orthodox Jewish community who either are already really thinking about and working on this, you know, on these issues, or are ready to.
Yeah, I agree, Yoshi. Rabbi Lederman, any thoughts on that?
I agree with what Yoshi said. I mean, I don't know if the question came from a place of that none of us identify outwardly as Orthodox Jews. I mean, I'm a Reform rabbi, but I don't think that we should presume that these topics are not being discussed. There are Jews of color who identify as Orthodox Jews, you know, here and in other parts of the world. And I think in some ways this is actually facing sort of the internalized racism in the Jewish community, but also the external work that we have to do in America, I think is actually something that's a shared value across Jewish denominations and Jewish and the just Jewish category of secular Jews and humanist Jews. You know, which is rare, you know, I would say, like that there's something that we have a shared value. I mean, I think there's a shared value, and it goes back to, Yolanda, what you said about B'Tselem Elohim, about, you know, what does it mean to treat every human being as made in the image of God. And so, yeah.
So we are getting really close to time. And so I want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to give like a 30-second wrap up. One thing that you would like to leave with our audience tonight, and then we will be able to wrap up. I have something to share, and then I think we can close out. So Tema, would you like to share?
Sure. One of the things that has been, I'm going to say, the most meaningful for me since, actually it goes back about a week before the murder of George Floyd, when an excerpt of the American Jewish Yearbook was published, asking the question of how many Jews of color are there, and sort of pushing back on that 12 to 15% estimate. And it was, I think, the first time that I observed a communal groundswell of pushback on behalf of Jews of color, and like in a very tangible way. And then a week later was the murder of George Floyd, and literally everything blew up. America was literally on fire for a while. And out of this it's almost a full year now, which is just wild to remember. It was Memorial Day weekend when George Floyd was murdered, or right after. It might have been the Tuesday, but it was right around then. What I have seen and experienced inside Jewish community, I've been sitting here talking about race and racism and the need to, you know, include Jews of color and recognize our unique contributions to our community and build leadership. I've been talking about this for as long as I've been a Jewish professional, so since 2009, and no one was really listening. And now it's just, in a very good way, nonstop. People want to hear about this, not just from me, but from all of my friends and colleagues who are Jews of color. Every conference that has happened during the pandemic basically has had something on this, and many before, but never at this pace. Federations everywhere, JCCs everywhere. This is just so topical in a way that actually feels like, oh, finally. And the thing that I want to leave you all with is, I think that there's an anxiety that a lot of us who have been standing here yelling about this for a long time have, that eventually, you know, the pandemic will eventually end, we'll get back to things in person again, you know, and things will kind of slowly return to something resembling status quo. And we're going to forget that we've been having all these conversations, because we're going to go back to the comfort zone. And I think for a lot of us, that's a big fear. It's something that I feel very acutely, like, okay, this is topical now, and what does it look like a year from now? Because let me tell you, a year from now, we're still going to be working towards this transformational change. And so what I hope all of you have come out of your own time, you know, on a Thursday evening, when I'm sure the weather, it's raining here, but maybe the weather is good there, you could be doing other things, that for each and every one of you to keep this conversation going. That's my big hope, is that the more individuals go back into community and say, look, we've got to keep talking about this, we've got to keep doing this, because this is for all of us, the more of a chance that we have to work towards that kind of transformational change, both for the Jews of color inside of our community to feel at home in Jewish space, and on behalf of Jews of color and other racialized people, and everyone else, because we know that when racism goes down, quality of life goes up for everyone. There's all sorts of statistics about that. And so I think, you know, making sure that we're actually just keeping the momentum. And that would be my big ask of all of you, is please, each and every one of you who have heard us tonight, please keep it going.
Thank you, Tema. Yoshi, one takeaway, or one thing you'd like the audience to take away.
Yeah. A few just like very, very quick things. One, I realized, like, in all this, we still never quite defined, like, what is anti-racism. So briefly, I think just understanding that, you know, I said it before about the way structural systemic racism has really just like been the undercurrent of society in the US and around the world. And I literally mean that word current. There's a flow, there's a trajectory, right? That even when we're not paying attention is happening. And so what it means is that, like, just being not racist actually isn't enough, because then you're still moving along in the current. To be anti-racist is to actively swim against the current. So just thinking about, like, what are the things we need to do to, like, counter what otherwise is a current that will just continue to flow. So that's one. Number two is that I think, you know, my work with embodied practice, both in general and with the anti-racism work and racial equity, is really understanding, like, the ways that racism has impacted all of us, and the ways that it has traumatized us in our going back generations, right? And the sort of under our new understandings of how trauma is actually multi-generational, and it passes on from generation to the next. And as well as trauma that we're actively experiencing in the here and now, right? We're all experiencing racial trauma, even if we're coming at it, you know, from different sides, which means that we all need to go through this work of healing from this trauma in order to bring ourselves as individuals and communities to a place of wholeness. And the final thing I say is just, tonight is Lag BaOmer. It's the 33rd of the Omer. This is a night where there's a number of different traditions around, like, what is Lag BaOmer about. One of them is that, like, the first 33 days, or 32, I guess, of the Omer were this period of sadness, of plague, of, like, where it was just like a very somber time. And that's not, like, in some ways, like, the plague broke, but it was just like there was this change at this point in the Omer. And so, and then we have like bonfires and, you know, haircuts and like all sorts of other quirky little things. So I hope that as tonight is in Lag BaOmer, and then in the macro, because of one, just acknowledging this pandemic, of course, that we've all been under, and then of course the dual pandemic of racism, that we're at that Lag BaOmer like catalyzing changing point, where we're able to really take this and move it into a better future moving forward together.
Thank you, Yoshi. Rabbi Lederman, would you close us out?
Take the next step, whether that's reading a book, putting a racial equity task force together in your community, doing something at your children's school, your grandchild's school, do something next, wherever you are on this path. And two, don't let perfection be the enemy of the good. You're going to screw it up. As white people, we were not going to get this right every time. Don't let that stand in the way of taking the next step. When it is pointed out to you that you said something or did something, just say, thank you. Like, thank you for teaching me, because it's lifelong. So that's what I'll end with.
Wow, thank you all so much for having this opportunity, taking this opportunity to share and be in this space. Thank you for your wisdom and your thoughtfulness, your vulnerability, honestly, to have this dialogue amongst yourselves and with our audience tonight. And with that, I know we are at time. We will turn it over to Karen and Ellen.
Okay. Hi, I want to thank you, Tema, Yoshi, Rabbi Lederman, and Yolanda for your courage and commitment. Thank you so much. Also, I want to thank Sarah, Ari, Donna, and Jessica, our amazing Federation staff who worked passionately to make this program a reality. And final thank you to Carrie Iris, our Vice President of Women's Philanthropy. Karen.
Your mind may be swirling with thoughts right now, but we hope you feel better equipped from the insights, ideas, and language you have gleaned to be part of making sustainable societal change happen. And yes, it may be one step forward and a half a step back, but with humility and an open heart, together, we can make a more inclusive, diverse, and vibrant community, not just in the Jewish space, but in the larger community. The ability to share, work, and play together make us all richer human beings, and to work together for justice at every level is exciting, as it's so full of possibilities. To that end, we encourage you to get involved and engaged with organizations, including one of Federation's partner agencies, the JCRC, which has been building partnerships and educational resources. Also, as part of the follow-up to this evening, you'll receive an email with such resources and additional information. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. Slow and steady. Good night.